All right, guys. Happy Pride Month Eve. Welcome back to the podcast. Back to Tomboy Official. Man, oh man. All right, so Pride Month. I don't really know the history of it, so while I'm talking, let me look up some things. So Pride Month. I know there's another month in Pride Month. So it says, it began on, at the Stonewall Riots, June 28th, 1969. There were a lot of gay liberation, I don't know what you would call them, I guess riots or protests or I don't know, like when you kind of just advocate, for even your own group. That's what I would consider it, is people advocating for their own safety and well-being. And yeah, so I've never actually been to this location, to Stonewall. So it says a gay bar and recreational tavern in Greenwich Village, neighborhood of Lower Manhattan, New York City. I've never been there. I've never been to New York, actually, but it would be really cool to go. Some reason I thought the Stonewall riots were in San Francisco. I don't know. I'm terrible at history, guys. I'm very forgetful of it, but I actually really love it. I don't know. History's kind of grim, but I actually really love it. I tend to enjoy watching documentaries and listening to stories from different sides of things. So that's something that I do enjoy. I haven't really gotten too much into the 60s and 70s yet. Not lately. I've studied a bit of, the hippie movement and other movements near the Vietnam War. And, I've definitely studied a lot more about, war history and war crimes history and propaganda and things like that, but I usually get stuck around World War II, and it's hard to really easily and swiftly and smoothly find a path out from thinking about that whole situation. It was a long time of just treacheries and chaos and death, and I usually get kind of stuck in history with all the things that went on, just because it doesn't fascinate me in a ooh, this is cool kind of thing. I don't feel like war is cool or anything like that, or killing or death camps or anything like that. I'm not into that kind of stuff. But I just have so many questions, and it just draws my attention to maybe if I keep learning about more and more, I'll get more and more questions answered. And I think that also, I kind of like looking at history, kind of like the parallels of everything kind of side by side. What was going on in some other places when other things were happening in other places. For example, World War II, like what was going on in countries that weren't directly involved, you know. Um, so I don't know, like things like that. But I do know that. So let me see. Sorry, I'm kind of thinking as I kind of writing and thinking at the same time. So the hippie movement was the 1960s and 1970s. Uh, the Vietnam War was uh, including Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia from November 1st of 1955 to the fall of Saigon on April 30th of 1975. So the Stonewall Riots happened actually during the time period of the Vietnam War and the hippie movement and all of that kind of stuff, which is kind of what I was speculating. One thing that I find interesting is, how things evolve over time. So one thing I want to talk about a little bit is, you know, how pride has evolved in my life over time. I can't really speak to, exact specifics of everybody's life, but I can talk about my life. And then another thing is not only how it evolved, how things evolved, but I guess like how do I word this? Like just kind of different events to do and things like that. And I'm not just going to talk about parties. I feel like, yes, if people want to party, go party. Go party. Like, might as well, But, one thing that I'm kind of noticing in general, which isn't something that's too hard to understand, but, I feel like the world and different areas of the world have seen multiple types of revolutions. And in my opinion, it seems as if, the Stonewall riots were a type of a revolution. Now, if I look up that term, you know, like in my mind, a revolution is basically some kind of event or purposeful action that takes place that goes against a major group, like resistance against a major, I don't know if you call it a power or authority or, majority culture group. So this says a noun, a forcible overthrow of a government or social order in favor of a new system. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I would see it, like that's not the only revolution that's ever really occurred. There were plenty of others, but something that I've kind of noticed is that it seems like over time there are these different I don't know if they're categories or areas. There are all these different groups uh, of people who have, created a revolution. And, you know, I feel like even with the Rona, we've experienced a form of that. Like, maybe it wasn't like actual, like, a war or like actual violence, but definitely, people having multiple years to be away from their regular norms and sitting outside of that and thinking about it and actually adjusting their lives more towards what they want and what they value versus what they've just done in the past. A lot of people focusing more on their mental health. Now, I do notice there are more mental health issues happening, but at the same time, more people are accessing mental health, and the mental health field has been opening, more services, ease of services, types of services. Like, yeah, so we've definitely seen that change. But, thinking back to, the late 60s, right before the 70s, um, you know, life looked pretty different, things looked pretty different. And, there was a lot of ideas from the 50s that were very, like, America kind of needs to look uniform. One of my favorite shows, which is probably strange to say, but, there's a show that fascinates me. It's so old. You probably know about Leave It to Beaver, and I'm talking about the old black and white one. I think it took place in the 50s, and goodness, that show is so weird. Like, there's no minorities really. I think I saw one black person in the whole entire series. Like, I've watched this show, like, when you have a series that you've watched, like, the whole thing multiple times. Like, I've been like that with The Sopranos, with a lot of other shows I've seen, like, every season, but this is one of those specific shows that I've seen every season. And there's one episode, I think it's the episode, spoiler alert, I guess, where Wally and Eddie Haskell are responsible for parking the cars at a wedding reception that's at, I guess, one of the dad's friends or family friends' houses. So they're basically getting the keys and parking the cars around the neighborhood so that the guests don't have to park far and walk. And so, I guess they're getting paid for that job and doing parking. And I think that's the episode where they go around to the back one day because they're service workers at this point, right? So they're being treated like servants, like, they're doing a service job. And I think they get told to, like, go around the back. And so I don't think this is Wally's house or Eddie's house. I think it's some other person's house. And they have a black or African American female, like, maid or, like, housekeeper or something. Somebody in the kitchen who's working. Just a black lady. She's working. And, it's kind of funny because, like, I've watched this show so much, and, sometimes I've skipped episodes and maybe didn't watch them all the way through. She's not a main character, but she's a service worker, or whatever you want to call it. She's working in the kitchen of this family during this event, and that's the only time where you see a black person, I think, in this whole entire show. And they just happen to be, a cook in the back, or, I don't know what her actual title was or anything. And as a black person seeing that, it's like, okay, that is weird. Like, it's almost like too weird, because it's like you happen to have a black person working back there, you know. I don't know if they were working the event or if they were actually like part of the families, like a worker that was actually like routinely there with the family, or worked for the family and came in to work there. I don't know. But there were so many questions. I was like, wait, like, can we go into that story more? Like, what's going on? But then, you know, I would say, you know, that was something that interested me. And, you know, just watching that show, I kind of learned about maybe not how households and things actually were completely in the 50s, but that was kind of like ideal, typical American representation there, without the diversity hardly at all. Um, Strangely, I always thought Eddie Haskell was black. Like, I think in my mind, like, he seemed black. Like, he had curly hair. I think his hair was blonde, and they mentioned it once. But because it's black and white, you can't really see. And in my mind, like with the timbre of his voice, I was like, he kind of sounds like a black guy. And like, if you listen to the way he talks, and like, you know, I don't know, there was something about it where I was like, you know, in my head when I was younger watching that, I was like, maybe he's black, maybe he's mixed. I never really knew until, you know, later on I realized, you know, what the reality was. But I mean, that show was even old when I was a kid, so like, you know, there weren't like black and white shows really coming out when I was young, um, at all. Like, but they were still on like Nick at Night and like all kinds of other channels. Like, I started watching it on TV, but I don't know. It was probably on Nick at Night or something. I don't remember, honestly. Um, but yeah, but I mentioned that to say, like, you know, that's kind of what the 50s looked like, was like, you know, like if you look at that, or look at, if you've seen that movie or that Netflix series, it's called Hollywood, there was definitely a lot of homophobia, a lot of racism. Like, you could get arrested still for, you know, homosexual activity of any kind. Like, if people knew about it, you know, you could actually get in some real trouble for that, legally. And so I'm just like, wow. So people came out of the 50s into the 60s. And there's this period of time where, you know, the people decide, you know, the young people decide, we don't really want this society that we've been given in the 50s. Before that, in the 40s, you know, midway through was, you know, the end of, like, near World War II. And the 30s were, God only knows, more wars all over the world. And, you know, the 20s, isn't that what they call the Roaring 20s? When does the Great Gatsby take place? But that's kind of how I like to think about history. I mean, I know that I have definitely a whitewashed, 1925, kind of a whitewashed, you know, understanding of things, but that's kind of how I was taught, honestly. Like, I have to go out of my way, not that it's bad, but I do have to go out of my way to educate myself more. And that's been a bit of a process too, because I've started that process kind of more newly, in all honesty, like around 2020, when I was first getting into studying finance, and I started studying a little bit more about history, but from different angles. And I was like, you know, because me and my friend, you know, I have a friend from Mexico, and he was like, you know, I never hear anything about my people. It's like, you know, there's this thing that happens, you know, in history where, like, people's cultures just get completely erased. You don't hear anything about it. And it's like, well, I know that we were there, you know. Like, he's Mexican. They have a deep history. I mean, I found out in maybe let's say like San Gabriel area where they had the missions and like other places around there with the I think they're called the Gabrielino indigenous people, but I think there was a different name. I think that was the name they were given by the Spanish, and a lot of people who were indigenous people would start referring to themselves as Mexicans. And so I feel like a lot of the history too can be lost, because my friend who is Mexican, when he takes I mean, I have more than one Mexican friend, but I'm just talking about this guy specifically. Like, he was saying that when he took his test, or like what do you call it, like a DNA test or whatever those tests are that tell you about your ancestry, and he said that the results showed that he was like mostly Native American, like I think like 90 something percent. So I'm like, well, you probably have a lot of tribal history, and maybe he was one of the groups of people that, they just started calling themselves Mexican. But, Mexicans technically are, an indigenous group of people. They just, had the Spanish there, and I don't know, I don't want to get into all that too much right now, but, yeah, so if you think about the 20s, the Roaring 20s, think about the Great Gatsby, the Flappers, all this like crazy stuff. The 30s, well, I guess World War One was before the 20s, and then you have the 20s, the 30s, where a lot of the economy crashing and things, and I don't know, that just sounds like a terrible period of time. Like the late 20s, pretty much all the 30s, most of the 40s, maybe the end of the 40s into the 50s, things started looking better, at least on the surface of America. And so, it seems like, if I think, like, just by going by, like, popular media, the reason why I mention it is because it's easy for people to kind of, like, see it and find it and view it and just be like, oh, like, that's kind of like one angle of a scope of like what things kind of looked like. So if you look at the 50s, everything in the 50s looked pretty there was like this it wasn't perfection, but it looked like some version of perfection. Like, if you look at Leave It to Beaver, it was like wholesome family, like the younger son who kind of got in trouble a little bit, but he's a kid and wasn't really doing anything too wrong. And then, the brother Wally, who, he just kind of does his duty as an older brother. His younger brother's a bit of a brat, but they're kind of homies. They get along enough. They share a bedroom. And this is a big house, so I don't know if it only has 2 bedrooms, but they're sharing a bedroom, and I think they have a guest room too. And they have a den. The dad has a den, so it's kind of like, even though they had space for an extra room, they shared a bedroom, and I guess that was maybe common back then. I don't really know. But yeah, they basically just followed what was expected of them. Went to school, joined social and athletic clubs, stayed in shape, went to church, went to work. The mom was a housewife, and she was always busy dusting and cleaning and being there for the kids and shopping and, keeping the house neat and clean and doing what she needed. And then, you know, on weekends they would kind of go out with their friends. And, you see this family kind of growing up, especially the kids. You see them kind of growing up, choosing different activities, sports, getting letters, all kinds of stuff, dating, all kinds of things. And it just looked like typical classic American family, um, or at least how they wanted to present it. As in, I mean, the perspective I gathered from it was, this is how your family should strive to be. Obedient to the parents. I think, there was like physical punishment. Like, they didn't show it in the show, but they kind of like alluded to, that the dad would like, hit them with a belt or something when they did something really out of line. Just different things like that. But it was like typical of the time. There was nothing about them that had any scandal or anything really. Like, there was nothing too outside of like what America would expect of them, And I know it's just a show, but it's like, shows can say a lot about history. So if you think about the 50s and that kind of image, and then going into the 60s with the hippies and them being like, we do not want that. It's like a whole counterculture where they're against all of that kind of, go to school, get a job, get a career. Meanwhile, there's all this other injustice and hatred and racism and homophobia and all these other things that have nothing to do with love. And, there's another part of society that sees, hey, there's a lot of inequality that, is still being, pushed in our society. Like, I've been watching a lot of these World War II movies and videos and all kinds of content, documentaries and everything. And one thing that's interesting is I've heard multiple survivors of the death camps of the Jewish, the Jewish people who are in those death camps, explaining their experience even after the war, where some of them came to the U.S. and they were like, oh, like, there's like a colored only bathroom, or like there's racism in this, state where they're living and all this kind of stuff. Like, they were kind of like, they left from a place that, a lot of them were like immigrants, or I don't know what you call them, if they were considered immigrants or refugees, or what the label was, but basically they hadn't lived in the U.S. before and they come over there and it's like that. Or like somebody else said, we can't even grab a drink together at a bar in the U.S. But then I think they were saying this in this show. It's like it's like a new kind of like animated short series on Netflix. You guys can tell I've been watching a lot of movies and shows. That's where I've been like binge watching stuff. So basically, yeah, there would be people that were coming to the U.S. and there were people who had fought in World War II who were Americans who said, we don't even, in my state back home, I can't grab a drink with somebody who's fighting right beside me. It's like they had indigenous people fighting, Mexicans fighting, all different races, black people fighting, all on the U.S. side, and, they're going to war together as one unit, and back home they can't be friends, or they can't do things together without getting backlash or doing something that's kind of like against what the public expects of them. I'm not saying that people didn't do it, it's just that it wasn't something that you usually see too much or hear too much about too often. Um, but yeah, 60s hits, and there's people who are like, we don't want that. Also, this war in Vietnam, we don't want that. And just kind of calling the US out on like, look, like, you guys are kind of saying that we're like a great nation over here. And here we go, messing everything up. And there isn't love and equality and things like that. And so that was kind of more of their focus. And there were a lot of youth, and young people, young adults who were part of these movements in bigger cities, flooding into bigger cities. In particular, they mentioned a lot about San Francisco and New York, but yeah, like there were just a lot of people who, the mainstream culture painted them as lazy. And I always kind of wondered if that's where the sign for no shoes, no shirt, no service came from. Because I feel like that would have been against, hippie culture, because a lot of them didn't wear shoes. A lot of them maybe didn't wear shirts. I don't really know. That's another thing I'd have to probably look up. Let me see. Let me see if I can find it. No shoes, no shirt, no service. Origin. Says there's no federal law. I don't really know. So they said it was an attempt to keep people out, that they simply didn't want to serve. So, oh my goodness. So yeah, that's what it says. Many teens from the late 60s to early 70s were basically being turned away because of their hair or lack of shoes or shirt. Yeah, so that's what I was kind of thinking. And then also probably homeless people as well who might not have shoes, or someone in like extreme poverty who might not have shoes. It's like, I think it was kind of a way to discriminate against people who were just kind of doing something different that didn't really fit the mainstream. And not necessarily that the mainstream was good or preferred, but it's what, was expected. So yeah, that's kind of how that went. And then yeah, like, so the Stonewall Riots were pretty much like near the middle of the hippie movement then. So that kind of gives it a bit of a timeline, or a lot of a timeline. And I'm not saying that that's the main reason why it happened, but it's kind of like, well, when people are, deconstructing, parts of society, it seems like a lot of different things fall into place. Like even with the Rona, we saw, Black Lives Matter movement was kind of increasing, more attention on police brutality, people were actually focusing on that. More focus on, healthcare and, discrimination within the healthcare system with different minority groups, who has access to different types of services, medical services, the government programs that were rolling out to help people financially. People were definitely calling out a lot of these other discriminations that were still going on at the time. It's like people were all forced to sit home and watch and listen and think, and they noticed all these things were going on. And I think during the hippie movement and during the Vietnam War, people would have also been tuning in to see kind of like what's going on. And I'm pretty sure that would have all affected the LGBT community, the trans community, you know and making powerful choices because of you know because of all the injustices going on. So let's see. I'm typing something on my phone right now. All right. Yeah, so it seems like it lasted a few days. Stonewall Riots, June 28th of 1969 to July 3rd of 1969. Let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to get to the link. So this talks about origins, timelines, leaders. So it says that in the 1960s, for example, solicitation of same-sex relations was illegal in New York City. And it says about gay rights before Stonewall. First documented U.S. gay rights organization was founded in 1924, but police raids forced them to disband in 1925, and there was America's first lesbian rights organization, Daughters of Bilitis, I don't know how to say that, in San Francisco, September 21st of 1955. 3 years before Stonewall, there was the Mattachine Society, an organization dedicated to gay rights, staged a sip-in where they only declared their sexuality at taverns. And basically at the Stonewall Inn, it says the crime syndicate saw profit in catering to shunned gay clientele, and by the mid-1960s, the Genovese crime family controlled most of Greenwich Village gay bars. In 1966, they purchased Stonewall Inn, a straight bar and restaurant, cheaply renovated it, and reopened it the next year as a gay bar. And Stonewall Inn was registered as a type of private bottle bar. They didn't require a liquor license because patrons were supposed to bring their own liquor. That's cool. Um, and without police interference, they could cut costs to how they saw things fit. The club didn't have a fire exit, running water behind the bar to wash glasses, clean toilets that didn't routinely overflow, and palatable drinks that weren't watered down beyond recognition. What's more, the mafia reportedly blackmailed the club's wealthier patrons who wanted to keep their sexuality secret. So people were getting blackmailed. And it was basically a mafia-owned place. Very interesting. But yeah, business is business. And yeah, so that's some of the early intro info. It says when the police raided Stonewall Inn on the morning of June 28, it came as a surprise. The bar wasn't tipped off this time. So police officers came with a warrant, roughed up patrons, and finding bootlegged alcohol, arrested 13 people. So, yeah, including employees and people violating the state's gender-appropriate clothing statute. I didn't know there was a gender-appropriate clothing statute back then. Damn. Female officers would take suspected cross-dressing patrons into the bathroom to check their sex. And, basically people were fed up with police harassment and social discrimination. Angry patrons and neighborhood residents hung around outside of the bar rather than disperse, becoming increasingly agitated as the events unfolded and people were aggressively manhandled. At one point, an officer hit a lesbian over the head as he forced her into the police van. She shouted to onlookers to act, inciting the crowd to begin throw inciting the crowd. Is it supposed to be throwing pennies, bottles, cobblestones, and other objects at the police? Within minutes, a full-blown riot involving hundreds of people began. The police, a few prisoners, and a Village Voice writer barricaded themselves in the bar, which the mob attempted to set on fire after breaching the barricade repeatedly. And then it says, there's a lot of stuff I'm skipping, and it says, on the 1-year anniversary of the riots on June 28th, 1970, thousands of people marched in the streets of Manhattan from the Stonewall Inn to Central Park in what was called Christopher Street Liberation Day, America's first gay pride parade. The parade's official chant was "Say it loud, gay is proud." So I like that. Well, I don't like all of it. I like the ending. That's from an article on history.com. It's just, the title is Stonewall Riots. Updated May 31st of 2022. So the original was written on May 31st of 2017, and I guess they didn't update it this year, so okay, that's fine. So I'm gonna post that link, and then so that's generally how it happened, why it happened, time frame of why it happened, and I don't want to make this way too long, so I'm going to talk about the pride evolving over my lifetime and events in the next episode, because this is kind of going to be too long. I'm really tired. You guys can probably tell. I'm like super tired, but I don't want to go to bed yet, so. And I don't want to watch anything. I was watching stuff earlier, so I'm kind of done with like watching shows and stuff. So yeah, I'm just kind of chilling, recording, but I'm talking really slow because I'm really kind of tired. My processing speed's a little slow, but that's how it goes. Alright guys, thanks for listening. You know, man.